of course, many people are really interested in getting into such a big tech company. So maybe let's talk a little bit about how did you get in there? Do you think, or is it possible to get into a big tech company? And with big tech, I mean companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, these typical FAANG companies. FAANG stands for Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, right? So do you think you can get such a job without a degree if you're completely self-taught? And maybe we can talk a little bit about how did you prepare for your job interview? How did you get noticed? And yeah, then we can touch on the details a little bit more. But yeah, how did you get into it, and how would you recommend people get found by these companies and actually find a job there?
Yeah, so I think that I get this question a lot, and I think there are two distinct phases to being able to get that job at big tech. And also, by the way, I think FAANG is a very interesting term. I think that people they really want to get a FAANG job. But I think the reality of the situation is that there's a ton of really great companies that are not part of the acronym. Like, for example, I mean, just off the top of my head, Airbnb, Robinhood, Pinterest, like these are amazing companies to work at. Uber, yeah. I mean, these are all great companies that have done engineering. On the engineering side, they're really smart people who work there, and they're solving tough problems, but they're not captured in FAANG. So I think that if we expand the definition a little bit, I think people can be happier, and they don't need to be so like focused on just those 4 or 5 companies in FAANG.
Yeah, makes sense.
But I think the process is similar no matter which company you want to go for. There are two distinct phases. Number one is, are you getting the interview? And then if you're not, then I'll talk about like some of the tactics I have to help you get the interview. And then once you get the interview, the preparation you do pivots or changes completely almost. So if you're not even getting the interview, like if you're self-taught, for example, and you don't have the infrastructure or the network of people around you to be able to get in touch with the recruiter, for example, then I think the burden is on you to demonstrate your capability as an engineer. And I think you've talked about this in a couple of your videos, Florian, but I think largely it just comes down to, have you published an app on your own? Or is there some demonstration of your work through a client or through some contract that you can say, hey, I built this, and you can check out the quality, and therefore you can see, my competency as an Android developer or as iOS developer, whatever it might be. So like building out personal projects or side projects is critical to being able to demonstrate that the company should take a bet on you and interview you. I think in my case, it was a little bit different because I had the luxury of this whole network and infrastructure, right? I went to Stanford, which is in the middle of Silicon Valley. And so literally every month or every, couple months, there would be a career fair where a bunch of companies would come in and they would try and recruit students. And so for me, it was very easy to walk in and basically hand my resume out to people. And I had a pretty good idea of being able to at least get the interview. And so that's the first stage. Like, is the company interested enough in you to offer you the interview? And then the second part of it is getting the job once you're getting the interview. And I think for that, that's where we have to start talking about DSA, or data structures and algorithms. So largely at these companies, the majority of them are going to be asking you questions about data structures and algorithms, things like binary search trees, linked lists, queues, stacks, and manipulating them. A lot of these are whiteboarding questions. And I think there's a lot of people who, a lot of discussion has been had around, is that the best way to actually assess people to be a software engineer at these companies? Because the reality is, like, as an engineer at Facebook, I very, very rarely, if at all, use any of the skills to prepare for the DSA portion of the interview. But the reality is that today, at least, that's how many of these companies operate. And so you just have to kind of spend a month, 2 months, 3 months grinding out a lot of these questions. And there's really only like 15 or 20 patterns that you have to recognize. And once you recognize those patterns, then a lot of the DSA questions become quite a bit easier. And then once you clear those, you can get the offer, hopefully.
Yeah, in my interview with Ryan Kay recently, he explained it to me like this, if I understood him correctly, that these data structures and algorithms concepts play a bigger role in companies where they have large apps, because the larger the app, the more these little optimizations play a role and the more important they are. If you have a small app, then you can get away with doing things inefficiently. But if you have an app like Google Search itself, then you really have to optimize it a lot. So this seems to be one reason why data structures and algorithms are so important in these interviews with these large companies, if I understood them correctly. Do you think that's correct?
I have a little bit of a different take. I think that I think if you're a product developer at Microsoft or Google or Facebook, speaking from personal experience, if you're just building out a new widget or if you're constructing a new part of the application, the chance that you actually think about a lot of the underlying mechanisms of performance and data structures of how your app is working is very little. Like very few people actually think about that on the job. Usually what will happen is that there'll be a team or there'll be someone who like kind of architected the whole thing. And maybe that person thinks about the runtime complexity and what algorithms to use. But the vast majority of engineers don't actually think about that on a regular basis. So I do think that there is a disconnect where when you're trying to get into these companies, you are being asked all these questions, but the actual application of that on the job is almost none. But I do think there is value because when you're given these questions, you it's not just the algorithm that's being tested. I think a lot of it is also like
your logical thinking, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Like your communication. So hey, explain what you did. And I think a large part of how you succeed in a tech company is the collaboration with other people. When you get stuck, how do you ask for help? Are you able to have a conversation with the interviewer to figure out something together, right? So it goes a little bit beyond the actual DSA and it goes into kind of teamwork and problem solving.
Yeah, this makes sense. So if I understood it correctly, then people can get in without a computer science degree.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. And in fact, it happens quite a bit.
Okay. And then they usually have to apply to these companies themselves, or do they have to get found?
I think that for these big tech companies, there's so much inbound. So if you just apply, there's a very good chance that you'll never hear back from the company. So almost always, what I recommend to people is either a referral. So if you know someone who knows you and trusts you and like thinks you're doing good work, if they work at one of these companies, a referral is a huge leg up in being able to get a call back. And the other thing is what we talked about earlier, which is if you have a published Android app, for example, and it has a meaningful number of people who are using it, that's also really impressive. So that can be a way to stand out.
Okay, so the app should actually be published, or is it enough if it just is on GitHub?
I think ideally it's published because basically what you want is you want it to be as easy as possible for the hiring manager or the recruiter to be able to look at your work and figure out that it's impressive or it has people are getting value out of it, right? And so if you publish on GitHub, yeah, maybe I could tell, but you're making me work a lot harder. But if you publish it and it has like a 4.5 star review and 10,000 people are using it, it's very, very obvious to me that, hey, you've built something which has value. And I'm sure you could do the same thing at my company. So I think publishing it makes it much more obvious if you have that option.
Yeah, I think there is quite a bit of a difference between having really an app on the Play Store and just having a project on GitHub. Because if it's just on GitHub, then you can ignore a lot of stuff. But if it's actually on the Play Store, then you probably have, for example, proper tests for your app because you have to make sure that it keeps working and you don't break it with an update. So you really have to focus on stuff that you can ignore if it's just a project on GitHub. So I can see how this makes sense. Is there a specific kind of project that people should build, or should it have a certain size? I assume that just building a small CRUD app where people just do some database operations, this is probably not enough.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I feel like my answer here is maybe it's a little controversial, but I think that it doesn't matter that much. What I care more about is, are you able to create software which people are getting value from? And so like the complexity of what you've done doesn't actually matter to me that much. It's much more about, hey, you built out maybe this dice rolling app or like some simple application. But the fact that you made it really clean, really polished, and people are actually using it, that is a really good indication to me that you're a good software engineer. You've thought through everything. You've made sure there are no bugs or no obvious issues. And that is, to me, the mark of a good software engineer. So the actual like algorithmic complexity of what you've built, that doesn't really weigh that much for me into how I assess engineer. Because as a solo developer, it's hard to really like, what are you going to do? It's hard to really create like some enterprise solution or like some very complicated thing, which is actually useful, right? A lot of it is going to be utility apps, and those actually have a ton of value.
Okay, so this is a really good point for people to put a real app into the Play Store. And I think it's also a fun way to learn when you have your own project out there. I also heard you mention in another video that Git and complicated Git commands play a really big role in your job. So should people focus on learning Git intensively?
I don't think that needs to necessarily be something that you prepare for in anticipation of getting the job, because a lot of that you'll be able to learn when you get there. I think that having some knowledge of version control is important in order to succeed at the company, because inherently you're going to be working with hundreds of developers, and being able to quickly check out their code and test things out and make modifications or cherry pick changes between branches, that will really help you as a developer. But it's not something that will come up as part of the interview process. I don't think, if you're purely optimizing for landing that job, I don't think you should actually focus on version control. That's something you should, learn on the job once you get it.